Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present here and on all the countries that you might be joining us today. Good morning. It's a great crowd this morning for the first Scholar Talk for 2022. We've got a lot of regulars with us today. Special welcome to you, and a warm welcome also to everybody who's coming to their first Scholar Talk this morning. It's great to have your company. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, which means that I get to look after the library's fellows, including running this, our Scholar Talk series. Now, if you have any questions at all for today's speaker, please just use the chat feature in Zoom, and when James has finished presenting, we'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can. So today is, of course, James Boyce. He was the library's Merriweather Fellow in 2020, which seems like a very long time ago now. And he is, of course, very well known for many of his books. And we have Van Diemen's Land, which some of you have already written in and said that you have read this book and enjoyed it very much. And I'm also very fond of his latest book out, Imperial Mud. It has a beautiful cover and it is, of course, beautifully written. And I want to just share with you one line in the acknowledgements, which I think really speaks to the integrity and the commitment of James to his historical practice. And he says, "I am grateful for not having been arrested." And I think that shows you what sort of terrific scholar James is. So today, the profitability of peasants. Thanks so much, James.
Hello. Hello, can you all hear me okay? Thanks so much, Rachel, for that introduction, and greetings from Hobart. I'm speaking to you from my home in Hobart on this big question in early New South Wales that we're going to be looking at today. It's a subject that until the 1950s was actually mainstream in Australian historiography and public debate. And there are recent signs that interest in this issue is returning. And for this, I'm glad, for in the contemporary context of the urgency of responding to the environmental crisis and reimagining relations with First Nations people, we need to be informed about what might seem a rather dry topic. I'm referring to the history of Australian land policy. But before we begin our chat, it's important to get one matter clear. Australia was not built on the sheep's back. For the first nearly 4 decades of European history, wool was of marginal importance. While sheep provided an increasingly important source of local meat, well into the 1820s, there was little interest in the animal's wool. Not until the 1830s did wool exports really take off and become the major driver of economic development. Nor was it the case that nothing much happened until then, because agriculture was dominated by ignorant and slovenly London pickpockets, incapable anywhere, let alone adapting to local conditions. In fact, the former convict small farmers had adapted remarkably well to the challenges and opportunities of New South Wales. These men and women fed the whole colony, including the large numbers of unproductive troops, civil officers, government men, service and manufacturing workers, visiting sailors, and urban dwellers generally, through methods that were condemned by a procession of privileged observers precisely because they were not like what had occurred at home. They'd adapted to local Australian conditions and were farming in a very distinctive way and farming quite successfully. As Governor Lachlan Macquarie knew well and tried to explain to John Bigge, the commissioner sent out from England in 1819 to deal with the political problem that New South Wales then was for the British government in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Australia was actually built on the peasants' back. It was not the few large-scale farmers letting sheep and cattle loose on the grasslands created and managed by Aboriginal people who were the foundation for the prosperity of the colony, but the labour of mainly emancipist farmers on small agricultural holdings. Macquarie actually warned London against encouraging, and I quote, a description of persons called gentlemen settlers, who by extraordinary concessions in their favour have not contributed to the advancement of agriculture in this colony. Macquarie was critical of, again, and I quote, these persons designated gentlemen settlers in contradicts distinction to those of a lower class, whose early and laborious habits render them useful to the colony and constitute them, properly speaking, the yeomanry of the country, they being the real improvers and cultivators of the soil. Until the early 1820s, the creation of such a peasant society was British government policy. Governor Phillip's 1787 commission, which was largely replicated for every governor up to and including Macquarie, stated that he was given full power and authority to emancipate and discharge convicts, and that in every such case, you do issue your warrant to the surveyor of lands to make surveys of and mark out in lots. Every male shall be granted 30 acres of land. In case he shall be married, 20 acres more. And for every child who may be with them at the settlement at the time of making the said grant, a further quantity of 10 acres, free of all fees, taxes, quint rents, or other acknowledgements whatsoever for the space of 10 years. These farmers were also to be supplied with the provisions they needed for their subsistence for 12 months, together with an assortment of tools and utensils and a proportion of seed grain, cattle, sheep, hogs, etc., as may be proper. So it was that was the vision, that the convicts would come, they'd do their time, and then they'd become smallholders feeding the settlement. They were exiles. This was to be, in a sense, their country. And after the first few difficult, hungry years that we all know so much about, these smallholders did their job of feeding the colony well. In a society and economy ripe with unproductive speculation, corrupt oligarchies, dodgy merchants, and immoral market manipulators, the men and women labouring in the backblocks were the bedrock of New South Wales economic security. And of course, when I say New South Wales at this time, it includes Van Diemen's Land. As Grace Karskens has described in her wonderful new book on the small farmers of the Hawkesbury people of the river, and I looked at in my first book that Rachel so kindly referred to before, Van Diemen's Land, the output of these emancipated peasants is not confined to corn, wheat, potatoes, fruits, vegetables, or pigs. These men and women also hunted, foraged, collected and constructed, using the resources of the bush, wetlands, rivers and sea which surrounded them. From formal and informal commons, depending on the locality, came palings, shingles, bark, lime, fuel, skins, game, eggs, clothing, feathers and shellfish, to name just a few of the natural bounty of the new land. Many also had stock grazing in the surrounding commons. It was this communally interconnected, environmentally attuned, emancipist way of life which was condemned by Commissioner Bigge after he was sent out by London to investigate the colony and make recommendations on the future of New South Wales. Bigge's evidence came mainly from free settlers, and in his correspondence and reports, emancipist farmers are denigrated, and the granting of what he dismissively calls allotments are then criticised as inefficient, costly, and socially harmful. In his reports of the early 1820s, Bigge momentously recommended that instead of small grants to ex-convicts and their children, land was to be given away in much larger units to free settlers in proportion to the capital they brought with them. The rich would get even more. With convicts, former convicts, and their descendants to be transformed into a well-disciplined labour force, totally dependent on their masters, not the bounty of their land for their survival and sustenance. I'm just going to shut the door because one of the neighbours is just starting to do a little bit of work in the garden. There we go. That's a bit more peaceful. So despite the fact Bigge actually had very limited empirical evidence for this policy reversal, he does cite a few figures supporting the so-called inefficiency of small farmers, but they have enormous limitations and by no means accurately measure their real output. Not least of which is he makes almost no effort to measure peasant output beyond the main grains, maize and wheat. Nevertheless, Bigge's judgment on the inefficiency of small farmers has been widely echoed by historians since. A form of what we could call environmental determinism has come to dominate historical and policy discussion. Australia was no land for the little man, let alone the little woman. Bigge was just simply facing environmental reality. A reality, according to this thesis, a reality that the British government had taken nearly 40 years to finally recognise, and that later populist local political leaders were to repeatedly deny again, as from the 1850s with self-government, they began a century of supposedly failed policies to redistribute some of the land. As S.M. Wadham, Professor of Agriculture in the University of Melbourne, in an essay written in the 1940s, explained, the realities of the Australian environment have not changed in the 125 years since Commissioner J.T. Bigge was called upon to survey the struggling agriculture of the New South Wales colony. This was a land that supposedly needed big units to be viable and efficient. 201 years to the month, February 1821, Bigge sailed out of Sydney, and 200 years to the month that his nemesis Lachlan Macquarie did the same, February 1822. This remains the dominant view. But what I want to suggest today is that this view of history itself has a history. And it's that history that I want to look at in the time remaining today. To understand the judgment of John Bigge and those he relied on, it's important to understand that from their perspective, this was not primarily an argument about efficiency at all. Rather, it was a moral argument about the way people, specifically the mass of ordinary people, should live and work, and the way that society should be structured. It was, in fact, the economic and social independence of the small farmers and the way of life that this independence enabled that was seen to be the primary problem. James Atkinson, in his account of agriculture and grazing in New South Wales, published in 1826, is an example of this way of thinking. He wrote that small farmers had very little regard for the comforts and conveniences of civilised society. Clothing, except where decency absolutely required, they had little regard for. and to bring up their families with respectability, make a comfortable appearance in the world, never once entered their minds. Their absolute wants being satisfied, the whole surplus produce of their labour was expended in intoxication and debauchery. Men of this description were but little calculated to improve and beautify the face of the country. Accordingly, their farms exhibit to this day nothing but a scene of confusion, filth, and poverty. Their first necessarily rude habitations of bark are still unreplaced with more comfortable dwellings of brick or timber, and their families have been suffered to grow up without education, useful knowledge, or religious principle. A more improvident, worthless race of people cannot well be imagined. Similarly, but more poetically, John West, the legendary anti-transportationist, prophet of federation, and long-time editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, wrote in his History of Tasmania that the narrow grants and wretched homesteads of the emancipist cotters presented but little to peace. The settlers, whose imagination pictured the rustic beauties and quiet order of the English farm, saw unfenced fields of grain, deformed with blackened stumps, a low cottage of the meanest structure surrounded by heaps of wool, bones and sheepskins, mutton and kangaroo strung in the branches of trees, idols and uncleanly men of different civil conditions, but of one class, tribes of dogs and natives. No green hedges or flowery meadows, notes of the thrush and nightingale. And I can assure you, I haven't got a quote here, but how these observers, these middle class observers, wrote of the emancipist women was even worse. But at least a keen observer like West could acknowledge that despite there being in Van Diemen's Land, the old name, of course, for Tasmania, in 1820, only 2 estates with any fences at all, yet in that year, £20,000 had been obtained from wheat exported to Sydney. The first crops, West says, were prolific. It was, to West as well, the very ease with which small farmers grew what they needed, and the fact that they seemed to aspire to nothing more, which was the main cause of offence. They were not, in fact, nearly aspirational enough. They were far too satisfied with just living in a bark hut, to stay living in a bark hut. So to understand why this is seen as such a problem, it's important that we don't just look at the New South Wales context. Obviously, that's unique in that New South Wales is a penal colony. But the reason this way of life is offensive to Bigge and other privileged observers, it's important to know that the judgment of the emancipist way of life was almost identical with judgments about smallholders and commoners being made by similar observers in Britain itself. This was brought home to me during my research for Imperial Mud, The Fight for the Fens, which again Rachel alluded to, my recent book, in which I explored the conflict which ensued over the long attempt to enclose and drain the vast wetlands of eastern England. The language with which the people farming the fenlands of Lincolnshire were condemned in the early 1820s was virtually exactly the same as the language being used to condemn the small farmers of the Hawkesbury or the Derwent Valley. For example, perhaps the most famous advocate for so-called agricultural improvement, Arthur Young, wrote of Wildmoor Fen in Lincolnshire in 1813 that so wild a country nurses up a race of people as wild as the fen. He saw fenmen as a mischievous race who were charged with laming, killing, cutting off tails and wounding a variety of cattle, hogs and sheep. Indeed, Young said he knew nothing better to fill a country with barbarians ready for any mischief than extensive commons and divine service only once a month. Then commoners drank, they worked only 4 days a week, and they could not be depended to work hard for the gentry's harvest. An 1819 condemnation of the small farmers of Governor Macquarie's own homeland, the Western Isles of Scotland, could also have come from New South Wales. A quote again, "The ancient system consisted in producing crops of corn, either with or without manure, as that could be procured from the richest fields, and this practice was continued till the land refused to bear any longer. Such grass or weeds as happened to grow on it were then suffered to accumulate for a series of years, and the same process was repeated in a perpetual rotation. The natural pastures were at the same time grazed by indigenous cattle." Quite a similar, in a different context, farming system. Tillage was conducted each spring in a most inefficient and slovenly manner. Quote, "The author, as Bigge was about to do in New South Wales, called for an enlargement of farms. This was all about the movement for agricultural improvement, which was about a new way of life." Nor, some of you probably will have noticed, is the language being used unrelated to that used to denigrate Indigenous peoples across the empire. Now, in saying that, I'm not suggesting that the impacts of the attacks on Indigenous people was any way comparable, or that race did not add a sinister undertone. Rather, I'm pointing out that there were similarities in the prejudice and language used to condemn the morality, the character, the work ethic, the customs, the religious practice, the land use, the housing, the dress, and the economic efficiency, and indeed what was commonly termed the savagery of all of these groups. So what is going on? The first point to remember is none of these pre-modern people conformed to the norms of the increasingly influential evangelical Christianity or the disciplined labour patterns required in an industrialised economy. All three groups, including the emancipists farmers of New South Wales, were part of a pre-modern world. There's just far too much casual commentary about the early British settlers of Australia that seems to just take for granted that early Britons were a modern, post-Enlightenment, already industrialised people. The truth is that Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century was not the Britain of the mid and late 19th century. By the way, itself was far from homogenous. The Industrial Revolution, the early 1820s, was only in its early. Popular custom and culture was still strong. Indeed, E.P. Thompson, famous British social historian, suggests it had had a revival in England in the 18th century. And that is, of course, without even mentioning Ireland, which pre-famine Ireland was very much a pre-modern economy and society. Nor in 1788 and for decades beyond was enclosure. That's the process which English history, specific meaning in English history, means the process by which common rights were extinguished and villages were essentially dispossessed of land rights in their own country. Complete. Enclosure was still very much ongoing in the late 18th, early 19th century. Between 1750 and 1820, 21% of England was enclosed by an Act of Parliament, or some 6.8 million acres. That's perhaps 30% of the agricultural land, and many more millions of acres still were enclosed by so-called voluntary agreement. Every year in the first 15 years of the 19th century alone, there were about 100 parliamentary enclosure acts a year. And the long French wars, which continued with only a short break from 1792 to 1815, marked the final phase in which most common rights were extinguished and ordinary villagers of Britain lost millennium-old rights to hunt, to graze, to traverse, to collect fuel, to forage, and so on over their own country. So once enclosures extinguished these legal common rights, the the property owner has what we understand as modern private property rights. Other people venturing on that land, or they own the resources of that land, and other people become trespassers. And this process of enclosure, whereby the common rights were lost, was widely resisted. And to justify what was going on, to overturn centuries, millennia really, of common rights, to justify the dispossession, the hardship, the cruelty and the suffering that came with enclosure, small farming commoners and their way of life were condemned. It was an ideological battle. So from the Soddy Fens to the Cumberland Plain and the backblocks of Van Diemen's Land, the attack on the character and economic efficiency of ordinary people was closely tied to the taking of their land. Attacking their morality and culture was integral to denying them their inheritance. Again, this was not a rational assessment of economic output, communal well-being or quality of life. The fact that people generally enjoyed a decent subsistence and had a rich social life was in fact the problem and the point. The issue was their ease of existence, the lack of disciplined labour, lack of effort, sustained effort to remake the earth and remake themselves, and the perceived immorality of the cultural customs and lifestyle this enabled. Now, this perspective was not uncontested in Britain, nor until after the Napoleonic Wars were peasants entirely lacking in official support. Indeed, ethical and policy backing for small farming had a long ideological and religious history, starting with Adam's banishment from Eden. Remember when he's commanded that he'll now have his punishment, Adam's, for the original sin, is to work the earth, to till the earth. And it was this tradition which found expression in government policy in New South Wales before 1815. Already by 1801, though, John Lawrence could write in his book, The Modern Land Steward, that the defenders' ideas so generally promulgated some years ago seem now to have nearly all melted away before the sun of reason and experience. Doomed because the defenders of the old commoners had preferred the savage state of man to the civilised. And I just better start moving a bit more quickly. We've got some time for questions. But so after the Napoleonic Wars is a time of enormous upheaval in Britain, mass unemployment, poverty and homelessness, hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning back without the welfare safety net of the commons, and a government hell-bent on reducing massive debt and slashing expenditure. It's a time of heightened social ferment, political process, and at least perceived a big increase in crime. And in this world too, evangelical religion, with its new standards of personal morality and harsh judgment on the norms of popular culture, was increasingly influential, as was the new political economy, which stressed the virtues of the free market and removing old controls on capital and undermining the old mutual obligations and responsibilities between rich and poor, what Thompson termed the moral economy. And in this context, it is that New South Wales was a political problem for the Tory government at home. Again, it's not that the emancipists are failing economically, but quite the opposite. Life is seen to be too comfortable in New South Wales. Transportation is not seen to be the deterrent of crime it's meant to be. And in the heat of public and parliamentary debate, some even claimed that the good life available in New South Wales was an encouragement to crime. Life for the poor, at least, and especially for crims, was not meant to be this easy. And the wily old colonial secretary, Lord Bathurst, dealt with this parliamentary unrest in the time-honoured way of governments by setting up an inquiry which would take years to report and be so wide-ranging that every complaint or parliamentary question could be just referred to it. Sound a bit familiar? The Commission of Inquiry had powers even greater than a Royal Commission today. Bigge had not just the power to investigate, but had an authority on the ground equal to the Governor himself. And the professional background of the chosen commissioner also might not surprise you, and has also stood the test of time. He was a lawyer. He's also something of a Whig and something of a modern man in his ideas of reform and improvement, all the more useful for a Tory government feeling the parliamentary heat from that side of the House. And Bigge and Macquarie, to put it mildly, did not get on. And both deserve a lot more consideration than I have time for today. But there is a sense in which these two different men embody the change underway within Britain itself. Macquarie had also was critical of the customary way of life which you'd find on the banks of the Corkscrew, always frustrated that the emancipist farmers wouldn't move into the well-ordered towns that he planned for them. But he much preferred them to the ever-complaining big settlers who seemed to lack, from his perspective, much gratitude for the handouts they were continually receiving from government. Macquarie even most unusually and most unwisely defended the smallholder emancipists in a pamphlet he had published in London in 1819 to refute some of the claims being made against him. Macquarie claimed that it's to the emancipist farmers that we owe our existence as a colony. It was founded for their punishment and reformation. They and their families form 9/10 of the population, for they only have supplied the king's stores with grain. The few free settlers I found here have certainly honoured this convict country so far as to establish themselves in it. They accept land and stock from the government. They dispose of meat at the store, have become possessed of property to a large amount, but the government is not yet indebted to them. To contrast them with the convict settlers in regard to the improvement of this colony is altogether out of the question. But Macquarie was yesterday's man defending yesterday's world, and he had missed the point. In a letter to Bathurst in 1823, after his return to England and not long before his death, trying to defend his record after the publication of the Bigge report, Macquarie still missed the point, arguing that the necessaries of life are very generally diffused among the different classes of society. Few persons are to be found who do not own farmlands, and the cultivation of gardens, even in the towns, tends greatly to the comfortable subsistence of the lower orders who live better than in any place I know. That is precisely still unaware that from the point of view of his political masters, that's the very problem. In contrast, Bigge, largely relying on the gentlemen settlers as his informers, or bequeathing the vast grasslands to the west and south of Sydney and through the Midlands of Tasmania, already, as we know, expertly managed by their owners before herbivores, giving them to wealthy immigrants to develop wool production was a potential win-win-win for the British government, both as it regards the employment of convicts, the saving of all expense to governments in their subsistence, as well as in the production of an export to Great Britain that is indispensable to the progress of her great staple manufacturer. And through effective supervision, away from the contamination of the big towns, there would be proper discipline and order for convicts, and with the horrors of penal settlements like Macquarie Harbour or Port Macquarie awaiting those who stepped out of line. So once land grants to small convicts ceased, as with the commoners at home, they would have no alternative then but to become submissive and subservient workers. In the time remaining today, I just want to raise, was there really an alternative policy realistically available given the nature of the Australian environment? It'd have to be like this. I mean, the rich river flats were one thing, but were not very large grants of land the only viable option available in the vast grassland of Eastern Australia. Just look, consider Macquarie's early plan for Bathurst, first region west of the Blue Mountains to be colonised. Sure, there was to be access to grazing land for big landowners, but there were also government grazing runs, and there were smallholders placed along the river near the new town, whose sustainability and prosperity was to be assured by access to common grazing country. I know you'll probably think I've gone a little bit crazy after 2 years COVID confinement into Van Diemen's land, and you might just be right in that. But I can see no reason why there could not have been smallholders in the Bathurst Plains and far beyond. The Tasmanian Midlands as well, or even the gentry stronghold of the hunter. If a large part of the grassland had been pastured in common, land held in common, what an un-Australian idea. But it is an idea that also occurred to John West, who in his History of Tasmania, 1852, lamented that, and I quote, "The English of modern times did not comprehend joint ownership, notwithstanding the once common property of the nation has only lately been distributed by law. It was only because of this change," West suggests, "that the gradual alienation of the hunting grounds of the Aborigines also meant their expulsion." Seems impossibly idealistic to us, but it's worth asking ourselves, why does it seem so unrealistic? This was the sort of society that Macquarie and many of his contemporaries had grown up in. It was a model of land use that still existed in England. It was the traditional one. It was still common in much of Europe. Reflecting this, a number of large commons for the benefit of smallholders and townspeople had already been proclaimed in New South Wales, particularly by Governor King. Macquarie had had extensive commons attached not just to Bathurst, but all his new towns. They were seen correctly as pivotal to smallholder economic independence and prosperity. That's how the smallholder becomes viable. Government grazing reserves could also have been continued to be established as they were in early New South Wales, set aside for various future uses and generating income in the meantime. And while we're at it, there's absolutely no reason by the standards of the time, and I would argue especially by the standards of the time, while large reserves could not have also been set aside for Aboriginal people, and also why their right of access to this common grazing country could not also have been guaranteed. Now, look, I don't want to pretend there could have been a utopia, or that there could have been an end to conflict over land. This is still invasion and conquest we're talking about. But the existence of reserves and the existence of large areas of commons would have allowed considerably more space for adaptation and for coexistence. The point is not whether or not there could have been a happy ending. I'm simply saying that there was nothing inevitable about what occurred. The radical change in land policy set out in the early 1820s, which defined a social and economic and political history of Australia, and still has such powerful resonances through to the present day. This was a policy choice. After Bigge, despite the best efforts of later reformers, Australia would not be a country of landowners. The mass of ordinary people would not be landowners until the suburban home ownership dream was fulfilled in the 1950s. Ordinary people then became smallholders in proportions not seen since the first decades, but not in the bush, but in the burbs. While the idea that Aboriginal land use could legally coexist with European use was finally legally acknowledged in the Whig judgment of the early 1990s. But New South Wales is no utopia in 1820, but I believe that Lachlan Macquarie was right in believing that regarding the interests of ordinary men and women, it was a lot better option than the land policy promoted by Commissioner Bigge. His land policy was a better option. And while it was not its intent, it was also a better option for First Nations people. Australia is not now seen as a land generally suitable for smallholders or capable of sustaining models of shared land use, let alone commons. But it was for a time, and it is important to remember that there is a history to what is now seen as reality. Whereas Isaiah Berlin, born in 1953, there are dangers in dogmas which tend to make us accept whatever happens is irresistible, for the very important reason that one cannot complain of what cannot be otherwise. I'll leave it there and happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, James. That was terrific. And I'm always fascinated that these palatable narratives of our history that we sort of latch onto, like the sheep's back, it's an easy story to clutch and say, oh yes, that's a great story. And the same too with this idea that we're a more egalitarian society than we really are.
Yeah.
So we do have some questions coming through. The first one is about your process as an historian and coming to an archive, a really well-known collection like the colonial collections at the State Library of New South Wales. And how do you push those sort of well-trod tales to the side a little bit and look at these materials to find something that might be a little bit different?
Oh gosh, yes, that's a process I really only often can answer in retrospect about the process of a book. Like, I think, as you probably already know, Rachel, that it was so helpful to get the Merewether Fellowship, because that enabled me to travel to Sydney and spend time in your wonderful collection. But at that, originally I was much more focused on Macquarie himself, and I spent a lot of time trying to, because I was even thinking of doing a biography of Macquarie at one point. But spending the time in that material, some of the questions I had originally sort of didn't grow, or they weren't sort of, while other questions that were really quite tentative at the beginning, or maybe didn't exist, begin to emerge as I'm reading it. And so I became more and more fascinated by this small farmer dimension from the reading and from reading secondary sources, but where these questions come from and how they emerge. And obviously, we're all products. I mean, the reason the history has to be rewritten in each generation is because our questions change, and I'm a product of our culture. In ways that we're all products of our culture in ways we're not even aware of. And so obviously a big question for our culture at the moment, which I live like we all do, is this question of how to be sustainable, to live sustainably on this earth, but particularly on this continent. And so and often, and quite appropriately, we're going back to Indigenous forms of land management and Indigenous forms of knowledge and knowing to help us in that task, to have that conversation at last, but belatedly. But I'm also very aware from other reading and work that there's different Western traditions of land use management, that we're not just this, we also have resources we draw on in our memory, in our ancestral memory and traditions and customs, and relationship to land. And I suppose, the discovery of the commons has been so exciting for me. I learned a lot more about that in England. And so I suppose when I'm reading early New South Wales, it's jumping out at me, the fact that there are all these vast commons as well. And so then I start asking questions about that, and you start looking for information on that. And it's a sort of process that's still somewhat of a mystery. But I always get comfort from the fact that, we'd be very worried as a historian if we finish in the same place as where we started, like this process of research and engagement with the material should be changing what we do. And we're not totally in control of that, like we're in a dialogue with the material. We're active participant in that, I am, but I'm trying to listen. I'm trying to listen as carefully as I can and try and get guided where to go with that. Very unsatisfactory answer, but it's, something I'm still working out myself.
Someone has got a much easier question. Have you found any evidence of locals at the time arguing against the transformation towards large land grants and actually speaking out in favour of these smaller holdings or these commons creations that you've talked about.
Yes. Oh, yes. The time there was quite a strong reaction to the big report locally. In fact, I mean, Macquarie was a defender, but Macquarie did spend most of his time defending his reputation. You know, like his, it wasn't. I don't want to overplay. He did speak up, you know, strongly for the small farmers. But after the publication of the big report, there was a lot of, you know, especially the New South Wales part of New South Wales, so to speak. I mean, New South Wales, as we now know, New South Wales, that the emancipist grouping, there were some quite powerful people in that grouping, so they had voice. You know, most people would have heard of Wentworth, you know, of course, famous. You know, the emancipists and their children in New South Wales did have media voice as well. Ironically, the Australian that was founded in the mid-1820s, not our current Australian, was a voice. And so there was some defence of them, but they lacked, in the end, political clout. And British government set the land policy. Some small land grants did continue intermittently, but really it wasn't until the 1850s with self-government you see the real reaction. And then there's a whole history, which I didn't have much time to discuss today, but there's really a century in which this question of how you redistribute the land and how you get smallholders back onto the land is a major, it's incredible how much we've forgotten it, really. It's a bit like the education debate, you know, the way that we just seem to move on so quickly. This was for a century, a major political point. And in Victoria in particular, there were some radicals really did manage to achieve that. But breaking up the big squat of land holdings and redistributing that land was a concerted political effort, you know, by the progressives for a century, with mixed results. And a lot of it wasn't, you know, there were a lot of schemes that were not feasible, if you like, which have added to the original view. You know, some of the soldier settler schemes, as we know, were not feasible, and small farmers were condemned to failure. And I think, you know, a lot of the best land had gone. So it was a sort of, some of them were almost set up to fail from beforehand. But there was a reaction, and there's continued to be a reaction. And there was, at least until the 1950s, I would say, a fairly sort of sustained public debate about this in Australia.
I have a question that's come in that's quite interesting, but it's a bit long. So I'm going to read it to make sure that I get it right. Wonderful presentation, James. Just a potential literary allegory, much used, I'm sorry, of land policy changes in New South Wales 1800 to 1820, and that is Great Expectations, in which Magwitch, first encountered and captured in the marshlands of Kent around 1812, is transported to early New South Wales, where he makes his fortune, if not his freedom. On his return 20 years after transportation, he appears, to me at least, to have represented the changing relationship the British have to New South Wales land ownership. And I'm wondering then if Dickens might have traced that shift from utopian commons to exclusive bigness in the background of Great Expectations. And they're wondering if you would like to comment on that.
Oh, that's fascinating thought. No, I'm not going to comment on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the background. But I must look. All I can say is I'm going to follow that up. And thank you. And if that person would like to email me, james.boyce@utas.edu.au, I'd really be keen to carry on that conversation, because I can't add to it at the moment, but I'd be keen to participate. That sounds absolutely fascinating. Yeah, especially the fact that, of course, it's the marshlands that I knew about. I mean, I know Dickens knew those marshlands well, and I did read a bit of that for Imperial Mud. They're not part of the Fens, but some of the unfolding story was quite similar.
we're going to try and squash in a couple more questions. We've got some more questions coming through. Someone is already very excited about the Dickens connection.
Yeah.
So there's quite a good conversation there to happen, I think. And I'm going to read this question as well because it is a little bit longer. Absolutely riveting. Thank you. Do you think that some of the ongoing mantra of small holdings being unviable in Australia is due to later history, such as the speculative cutting up of big properties in the late 19th century Depression and fobbing off poor, unwatered bits with, of course, no commons, and the soldier settlement subdivisions, which, of course, you've already referred to today?
Yes, and what happened in the 1890s, I absolutely agree with that comment, and I'd say definitely yes. So some of them are almost set up to fail, and it's at another time I'd like to do more work on that. But I mean, the starting point from the land reforms in the 1860s and then those 1890 schemes is that the best well-watered land, the lands have already been carved up into these. It's a rearguard action, a difficult process, and it's often not the best land that's being redistributed. Even that land has difficulty with access to water. There's not an access to commons, which I think the commons is in the Australian conditions was critical to viability, and there were commons established through most New South Wales towns in the second half of the 19th century. Again, in history, we don't know. The new towns of New South Wales, they did establish town commons, but most of them were lost by the end of the 19th century. So there's there have been a couple of historians, Bruce Basketball being one in Sydney, who've done work on the commons. But we need to do a lot more of that, I think, too, because that was also part of the own viability. But that question was spot on. I would affirm that was very much part of the story. And then the big commission gets reinterpreted in the light of that experience as well. Yeah.
So someone's mentioned Caroline Chisholm and how she proposed smaller settlements in around 1842, 1844, and how her idea was for landholders to lease to groups of people who would then clear and cultivate and hopefully take care of those plots of land. Are you able to comment at all on that idea?
Yeah, and I mean, there's the history, the ideal of the yeoman or small farm, because we can still connect with it, probably in our minds even today. There's an agricultural ideal of the hardy, self-sufficient yeoman farmer that continues to persist, and the idea that that's integrated to that idea of independence and hard work. There's a morally redemptive aspect of that, which goes back a long way in Western thought and was expressed in early New South Wales land policy, that does continue to find expression. There's a policy of concentrated settlement that Wakefield, proposes in the early 1830s when they try to control the movement of sheep. And Caroline Chisholm's thinking like that is expressive of that tradition. The difficulty is all sorts of, again, it's something I'd like to do a lot more work on, the later history of the smallholder ideal, because it continues to persist, it continues to find expression, but it's always up against, in the end, this problem that the best land went remarkably quickly, So, you're talking, people are moving, like Tasmania, they're moving into the heavily forested country of the northwestern emancipists farmers under terribly trying conditions. And these enormous forest country, the forests of Gippsland and southern New South Wales. This is the sort of land that's left. The easy country are gone. So they're almost too late. But that idea of leaseholder, I don't know much about the specific what she's proposing there, except that a lot of the early land, the sort of land legislation that came after self-government, there were schemes always, because obviously smallholders aren't going to have cash to buy land up front. So there's always, after the end of land grants, there's always schemes where you have to come up with some scheme by which they get the land initially, either on a lease system or, they pay it off over time, and it's after a period of residency. I mean, we could talk about America as well, because America was continued famously with a small to try and get, that's the heart of the American it wasn't always reality, but it was their ideology, was that this was a land for smallholders, and the famous homesteading acts. So Australians or reformers are always looking to what's happening in America as well, where smallholders could go and get free land, and that was what the American Republic was pushing and promoting as part of its essential ideology. So Australia's influenced by that as well.
Well, more work to do for James, by the sound of it. That is unfortunately all we have time for today. I could talk to James for a few more hours. We almost missed our 11 o'clock start time because we were busy chatting too much in the...
Yeah, and I'm sorry about my at the beginning. I wasn't quite sure, because when I saw the blank screen, I thought, oh, am I on?
So I want to try and finish up on time. James's books are available in the library shop, the two that I mentioned in the introduction, and Working Our Way Up the Eastern Seaboard, 1835 is also available. And if you order through the library shop, they will do free postage and handling anywhere in Australia. And if you are a friend, you can also get your shop discount as well. Please join us next time, Tuesday the 1st of March at 11. Our inaugural Ross Steele scholar, David Hanson, will be talking about George Lambert's Convicts Mirror. So if you would like some really exciting and very fabulous Australian art history, please join us for that. And if you can't wait that long, Kate Fulligar will be online at the library on Thursday the 10th of February at 6 p.m, an evening talk if you're still at work or you're at home, and she'll be talking about her terrific book, The Warrior, the Voyager and the Artist. Otherwise, I hope to see you at the next Scholar Talk. Please stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you online soon. Bye-bye. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks, everybody, for being a part of today. I really appreciate it.